My grandmother read her horoscope and talked to the conjure woman to make the right tea to solve a problem. Some of my friends find peace in yoga and Buddhist meditation. Other Black folk gather crystals, turn tarot cards, and set up ancestral altars, and go to church every Sunday. Or maybe they don't, because churches condemn their practices, but they have no problem with Jesus.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna trouble the water.
Welcome to Diverse Devotions, Black Belief Across Boundaries, where we wade into the waters of religious multiplicity, Black faith, and spiritual journeys. Discover what happens when Black spirituality breaks the rules of how being religious is supposed to work. I'm Monica A. Coleman, writer, university professor, ordained clergy person, and initiated Iyala Orisha. In Diverse Devotions, I'll lead you through a tapestry of captivating narratives and thought-provoking dialogues. We'll hear the spiritual journeys of Black folk who practice more than one religion. We'll also hear from individuals whose acceptance of different religions emanates from an understanding of laws of nature and universal spiritual principles. From the freedom of religious multiplicity to the personal journeys of transformation, each episode offers enlightening perspectives that expand the boundaries of Black belief. So, if you're a seeker hungry for knowledge, religiously devout, an educator curious to understand, or simply intrigued by spirituality's rich diversity, follow and like Diverse Devotions. Be a part of this journey, because at the heart of these stories, you'll find the spirit of freedom. Well, I am excited to welcome to the podcast today, William David Hart. William David Hart is the Margaret W. Harmon Professor of Religious Studies at Macalester College. He is the author of The Blackness of Black, Key Concepts in Critical Discourse, Afro-Eccentricity, Beyond the Standard Narrative of Black Religion, Black Religion, Malcolm X, Julius Lester, and Jan Willis, and Edward Said and the Religious Effects of Culture. His research interests include Black studies, social theory, philosophy of race, American philosophy, and the intersections of religion, ethics, and politics. I'm also going to add that Dr. Hart was also the former president of the Institute for American Religious and Philosophical Thought. And I have known Dr. Hart a long time, and we've had great conversations over many years, and I'm so excited to welcome you to Diverse Devotions. Welcome.
Thank you.
So this is going to be a really different kind of podcast, everyone, because usually we're talking to people who identify as practitioners, as people whose own spirituality kind of breaks the boundaries that we normally think about religion. But Dr. Hart is one of the few people, I would say, who writes more explicitly about people, Black religiosity in particular, and people who break the rules for how we think Black religion is supposed to work. And so I wanted to talk with him. And I think I've known you, I won't say almost, not quite 20 years. Oh, it is 20 years.
At least 20 years.
It is about 20 years. We used to both be in Greensboro, North Carolina at the same time. And I was so hungry for conversations about philosophical theology. And there we were, different universities, different schools, but in the same city. And so we'd go to lunch and I'm like, oh, just talk philosophy to me. And I'm like, oh, listen to me talk process theology to you. And in full disclosure, Bill Hart is a pragmatist, but we're like first cousins to process people, I would say.
Although I should say that I actually read process theology and philosophy before I encountered pragmatism.
But you still chose pragmatism?
Well, I mean, you put me on the spot. You can choose new things without leaving old things behind.
That is true. It's a both and world, right?
Right.
So, in two of your books, let's just get right down to it. You have a phrase, this concept that I loved when I first heard of it. And I was like, yeah, that's it. And you call it the standard narrative of Black religion. So, I guess I want to ask you about this term. And then also, how did you come to study people who live outside of the standard narrative of Black religion?
Two or three good questions there. By the standard narrative of Black religion, I simply mean that there is a practice, a tendency, a set of assumptions which sort of draws a homology between being a Christian and Black religion. And so Christianity comes to not only norm what Black religion is, but it norms what Black identity is. And so I would read accounts of Black religion and I would see interesting ways of being Black and interesting ways of being religious that seem to be absent from those accounts. And I've long been interested in religious autobiography. And so I was reading some of these people. I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. Unlike a lot of people who simply read it as a kind of coming of age story of a political thinker and leader, I read it as an religious autobiography. I put it in the long tradition of Augustine's Confessions.
Totally.
I, I also read Julius Lester. Julius Lester, for those who don't know, was a photographer, folk singer, and sort of assistant to Stokely Carmichael when Stokely Carmichael was head of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he eventually, as an adult, converted to conservative Judaism. He was raised as a Christian. As an adult, he converts to conservative Judaism. People like that are sort of outside of the standard narrative. Also, Jan Willis. Jan Willis is a scholar of Tibetan Buddhism. I think she's retired now. She taught at Wesleyan for many years. She was from a small mining town, Docena, in Alabama. She was raised in a Baptist church. Her father was a deacon in the Baptist church, as my father was a deacon in the Baptist church. And she was involved in student activism at Cornell University in the late 60s. In fact, she was one of that group of students who seized control of Willard Straight Hall. And they were protesting, and similar protests were occurring all around the country for the establishment of the Black Studies program.
Right.
And she converts, or I should say, she's initiated into Tibetan Buddhism as an adult. So you have three Black religious autobiographers who were raised as Christians and who, as adults, convert to different religious traditions. For years, I taught a course that centered on these three figures. We would also read Augustine's Confessions in that class as well. And invariably, my students, they react in a peculiar kind of way. They could sort of relate to Malcolm X, although they found his Islam to be deviant. They could not relate to Julius Lester at all, and found his Black Judaism to be really deviant. And they thought Jan Willis, being a Black Buddhist, was bizarre,
Wow.
and that struck me. And so it was this sort of pedagogical, reaction that I got, a response to my teaching that I got, that sort of drove my desire to kind of explore that and try to figure out what it was all about. And so I coined the term the standard narrative of Black religion to try to make sense of what I was experiencing in the classroom.
I have so many follow-up questions. So, one, I've noticed that the three people you're referring to, right, who you write about, Julius Lester, Malcolm X, Jan Willis, they all have a really good level of political activism, of Black political activism in the late 60s, mid to late
Yes,
60s, right? So they're all kind of, in different ways, Black freedom fighters, maybe
exactly.
to say. I'm curious to know, when you're teaching this, what generation of student were you teaching? And you have a good long career, so I'm not assuming it's one generation, but what generation or generations of students were you teaching who are having this, kind of repellent response?
I guess I was first teaching this course about 20 years ago. So I mean, I probably was teaching millennials.
Like millennials? Okay.
I probably for the most part was teaching millennials, and um, but even when I had an occasional older student, sometimes I taught students who were of my age or even older. They also found some of these forms of religiosity to be bizarre, or if I can put it this way, as alien to blackness, as somehow exhibiting a kind of inauthenticity. That those were not religious options or alternatives that an authentically black person should be engaged with.
And so this is what you're pushing back against, right? That blackness must equal kind of a Christian Protestantism, right?
Right, exactly.
Now, I don't know, I can't remember now because I've read your books a couple of times, but it has been a couple of years. Do you have a sense of how did this happen? How did we get this standard narrative of Black religion, right? How did we go from just being, at least in the US, right, a pretty multi-religious group of enslaved Africans to be Black means to be Protestant Christian, right? We know
Yeah.
that's not the reality, but that is kind of the sense, right? This narrative. How does this happen?
Well, of course, you'd have to tell a kind of a long and deep sort of historical story about that, how that happened. But you think about the process of enslavement,
Mhm.
probably somewhere around 500 linguistic, ethnic, tribal, whatever kind of, group designation you want to use, people who were brought from Africa to the New World. And some of these people might have been traditional, enemies. They're all thrown together under the condition of slavery. Over time, they lose, especially in the United States, they lose access to their African languages, and there has to be some kind of organizing principle. And so Christianity becomes that organizing principle. And over time, it took a long time. Over time, the vast majority of enslaved Africans, or at least a significant majority of them, became Christian. Now, this took a long time. This is something that people don't think about a lot, but it really wasn't until about the second decade of the 19th century that a majority of enslaved Africans converted to Christianity. And we have pretty good evidence that many of those enslaved Africans were practicing at least residual forms of traditional African religions, as late as the second decade of the 19th century. So it took a long time for the destruction of traditional African religions and the emergence of Christianity. So you're right. People of African descent brought to their continent, they brought an incredible diversity of traditions with them, including Islam.
Right.
I need to accent that. Recent scholarship suggested anywhere from 10 at the low end to 20% of all enslaved Africans in the New World were Muslim.
Good
And
numbers.
so an incredible sort of diversity, and I should add this as well, a small percentage of them were Christian. And they were not Christians by the Europeans who enslaved them. They had already, encountered Christianity before the process of the transatlantic slave trade began. So it was a very, very complicated and complex religious stew that characterized Africans who were brought here under slavery over a long period of time. Again, that those differences are sort of pressed down, they're worn out, and Christianity becomes the sort of organizing set of myths and ideas for Black people in the New World. And um, Christianity became a safe haven. It became well, I mean, it became a safe haven. And so I think over time, just an equation sort of emerged between being a Black person and being a Christian. And I think that got reinforced by various forms of scholarship in the 20th century. It was narrowed even more. And so I think that's how it happened.
So then what happens, right, when people live outside of that, right? I guess that's I have two questions. I'm gonna put them together.
Right.
Right? Right. That's who you've been reading. These people who live outside of this narrative. What happens when that happens? And then can you say more about why this was such a difficult spiritual path for your students, right, to grasp? Was it just because it fell out of that narrative? They think it was invalid? Were they surprised? Or, what made that so that all these years later, right, from 1960s to 2000s, right? I guess they called them the aughts, right? The 2000s and 2010s, students are finding this to be problematic.
Well, I mean, part of it is already described by Du Bois. He
Mhm.
describes this both in his really early church studies. I think it was published the same year as Souls of Black Folks, so that might have been around 1903 or so, where he talks about how the church, for all kinds of contingent historical reasons, became an all-purpose institution for Black people. That in a way, the Black church preceded, as an institution, preceded the Black family. And so when you think about it that way, that
Mhm.
slavery makes traditional family life impossible
Mhm.
because families are always being separated, people are being sold off, parents don't have the kind of authority over their children that they typically have, that the church served all kinds of functions for Black people that perhaps historically it's never had to serve for any other people. And
Mhm.
that made the church of supreme importance. And it's stereotyped the Black community in many, many kinds of ways. Um, some people may look at, for example, Raphael Warnock, the senator from Georgia, who's also clergy. I think he might be among the last generation of Black leaders, political or otherwise, who are also clergy.
Mhm.
That's a residue
Yeah.
of the fact that the Black church was a school for leadership.
Yeah.
It was a school for business. It was a school for virtue. It was an all purpose institution. So the Black church always played this outsized role in the life of Black Americans that it simply has not played in the lives of other communities who had other kinds of institutional outlets because they were not, subject to the kind of domination that Black people were. And so, again, we're most Black people are socialized into thinking that the Black church is simply a an important constituent of Black identity. To be Black is to be affiliated with the Black church, even if you are only a CME Christian,
Right.
Christian Eastern Mother's Day.
Right.
Still, it has a very important kind of confirmation, power in that respect. So I think that that's part of what the students were reacting to, but also because of the outsized role of the Black church, you might not encounter many Black religious others.
Mhm.
If you lived in certain urban areas, large cities, you probably encountered members of the Nation of Islam. If you lived in cities back east, for example, Philadelphia, you would have encountered Muslims who were Black, who were
Mhm.
not members of the Nation of Islam. But outside of cases like that, the vast majority of Black people were not encountering, you know, Black people who weren't Christians.
Mhm.
You were the Christian or you were a heathen. It was unlikely that you were going to meet Black people who were Jews. If you lived in the Northeast, especially in New York, you probably would have some familiarity with Black Jews. Or if you were in other large urban Black areas, you might, encounter some of those groups that came to be called cults, who were deviant, in various respects. But for the most part, um, most Black people simply did not, encounter Black religious others of the kind that
Mhm.
I try to address in my book.
So even in the midst of this, not everybody Black is Christian, right? Not
Right,
everybody Black is
right.
Protestant Christian in these kind of normative ways. What happens there, right? I mean, not that you can tell everyone's story, but can you reflect a bit on this academically? Because you come up with a term for this and you begin to kind of characterize it.
Well, I mean, part of it is a result of the way scholars did their work. I mean, there are a whole set of Black church studies
Right.
uh, going all the way back to Du Bois, Carter G. Woodson wrote one, a whole host of important Black scholars, oftentimes working in the historical and the social sciences, who wrote studies of the Black church. And they identified Christianity in the Black church with Protestant Christianity. So they tended to ignore Black Christians, even who were not Protestants. There was a significant Black Catholic population, for example, in Maryland.
Right.
An even larger Black, Catholic population in Louisiana and Mississippi. They fell outside of the category of the Black church, so they were simply ignored, in these Black church studies. And so historians created a term, an entity called the Black church. And the Black church was a Protestant entity, and for the most part, it was composed of only three denominations, Baptist, Methodist, and Pentecostals. And even Black Protestants who fell outside of those groups, especially if they were closer to higher church forms of Protestantism, like Anglican, for example, or even Lutheran, they simply were not included in the sort of stereotypical understanding of what the Black church is. So I think that scholarship also sort of canalized this very, very narrow understanding of what Black religion in general is, and even what the Black church is. And so my students were the recipients of all of that received knowledge.
So tell us about your term Afro-eccentricity.
Well, sure. So I've said a little bit about what I call the standard narrative of Black religion. And that narrative, as I indicated, sees Black religious others. And in my case, I was interested in Muslims, Jews, and Buddhists as deviant, and as deficient in relation to a Christian norm. That's the important thing to sort of think about, that Black religion and Black identity, they sort of, they norm each other. So to be a Black person is to be a Christian. Well, I'll just sort of leave it at that. And so for me, Afro-eccentric, I have to, let me, so can I sort of read what I say about it? Because I think it'll come
that's
across.
fine. Yes.
So this is what,
you can cite yourself.
Yeah, this is how I describe it here. Against the backdrop of the standard account of Black religion, which I just described, I accent those figures who do not conform to standard expectations of what it means to be a Black person and a religious person. Figures who are eccentric, Afro-eccentric. Afro-eccentric is synonymous with different. It refers to ways of being Black that are off-center, off-color, and outside the statistical, if not the axiological norm. And I try to use those terms for a reason. They're off-centered, so they're at the margins of what's typically regarded as Black religion. They're off-color, so I'm sort of playing on a pond. They're forms of religiosity that somehow render you not authentically Black, and they're because they are minority expressions, they're outside the statistical norm, but also, and this is important, they're outside the value norm, the axiological norm. They're seen as deviant. So that's what I mean by Afro-eccentricity. And so it's ways of being Black, it's ways of being religious that don't conform to the standard notion of what Black religion is, or what a Black person is.
So we have, and I love this term, that's why I wanted you to talk about it. We have people who are on the margins of the margin, right? Because Black folk are already on the margin of even more dominant US Western narratives. And then there's another margin that you're talking about.
Exactly.
How the people you studied, the figure you studied, how do they navigate that, right? Why would you put yourself on a margin of a margin if you didn't have to, right? Can you, how have they negotiated this?
I mean, with great difficulty. I mean, I would recommend a recent book. It's not too recent now, about 7 years ago, published by my former graduate school mate, Judith Weisenfeld, A New World of Comment, where she looks at some manifestations of what I would call Afro-eccentric forms of religiosity, usually in urban areas, some of which many people are familiar with, including the Moorish Science Temple, Father Divine, and several other examples. Um, they navigated that space with great difficulty. They were regarded with great suspicion by the standard Black community, but they also came under all kinds of assault by the larger white society. You know, not only were they deviant because they were Black, but they were super deviant because they were not Black in the ways in which white power was accustomed to encountering, you know, Black religious folks. And so you're right, they were doubly marginalized, maybe triply marginalized. But I think, like all religious people, they found the message and the way of life within those communities compelling, and so they persisted.
I mean, this is so rich. And I guess I have two questions which are connected. And even though you're talking about spiritual autobiographies, and you know, I'm a fan, I've written one, and individual journey, where is the role of community in that? I think I'm going to hold back on the second question. What role does community play? So you're on the margin, in the margins, but they're not alone necessarily.
Yeah, I'm always sort of. So what role does a role? What role? I'm being inarticulate here. What role does community play specifically
In
in these
in the
traditions?
lives of the Afro-eccentric, we'll say.
Okay, okay. I mean, I think that community is always sort of, um, there's a dialectical interplay. Let me put it that way between community and individuality. Um, but I think that when you are part of a minority community of any kind, uh, there are stronger forces of conformity, almost by necessity.
Yeah.
So if you're going to be a minority religious group, you're probably going to have tighter bonds of community, tighter uh, uh, tighter forms of institutional and traditional discipline than you're going to have if you're in other kinds of traditions. And so I think that individual expressions of one's spirituality are going to be governed and normed more powerfully within religious expressions of that kind than they will be in other kinds of religion where things are looser.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I have a good friend who grew up as a that's I'm repressing. That's terrible. I'm repressing one of the so-called. I hate to use this term because it's bad, but one of the groups referred to as the four cults. I don't know if you're familiar with that text that was written back in the 50s. It was
No,
written
I
from a
always think
Protestant
about
point of view.
Arthur Fawcett's text.
Not Voss's text. The Mormons. It was the Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Christian Scientists, and forget the fourth group. In any event, he would always sort of envy the freedom that I had as someone who was reared in a Black Baptist tradition to make certain kinds of choices and to express myself spiritually in ways that he could not, because his spiritual life, even on an individual level, was governed in a way that mine was not. And so I guess that's what I would say about these groups, is that community is very thick, and that the thickness of community has two sides to it.
Right.
It can smother you, or it can feel like you're being smothered, or it can make you feel like a baby wrapped in tight, warm, swaddling clothing. Mm. And I think that's part of the attraction of those kind of communities, that they embrace you tightly, and they make you feel, important in a deep sort of way. Of course, if you fall afoul of them, or if for whatever reason you become disenchanted with things, it can feel differently. I don't know if that answers your question about community or
No,
not.
it really does. 'Cause I think community becomes more complicated, right? When you're breaking outside of norms and you're breaking outside of boundaries. And you might feel like you belong to two communities that are really different, but still important, right? And as you said, I love that swaddling analogy. That when you're for some people, it feels great to be in a thick community. But I think if you want to break out of it, you're not just like, say you feel like you're having a different faith experience than that community, to change your faith to lose your community. Right.
Right.
And I think it's so much to ask someone to really lose, to give up, right, a core community that shapes them. Because it's religious, but it's also cultural in many ways.
Right. And that the kind of spirituality that one experiences in a thick community uh, is unlikely to become unmoored
Mhm.
from the disciplines and the traditions of that community. So one of the interesting things I would say about contemporary Christianity, Protestant or otherwise, and this is true for so-called, Black Christianity, the Black church, is that because institutional disciplines are not as tight, um, individual expressions of spirituality are very easily captured um, by American consumerism, and it can be very hard to distinguish spirituality from just sort of consumer desire and consumer pursuit. So there's a way in which one can live one's religious convictions um, in a more faithful way, if I can put it that way. Faithful way, not faithful, but maybe faithful to a faithful way within those traditions than one can, I think, in contemporary forms of Protestant Christianity, where um, it's so easy to commodify and market the spirit.
All right. I gotta ask you about justice and freedom fighting, right? Because if there's something else that seems to be connected to Black identity, it's that desire to be free because we aren't. And the people you've referred to earlier, going back to the very beginning of our conversation, right? You're talking about Julius Lester, Malcolm X, Jan Willis, who were all involved in different but freedom movements of Black freedom movements of the 1960s. Look, thinking of them, but also thinking of other Afro-eccentrics, if I can make that into a noun, right? Of other Afro-eccentrics, where's justice? Is freedom? Is that still important? Is that still part of a faith practice? Or can you tell me a little bit about what you found to be the role of justice seeking?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question. It's hard for me to say with respect to Afro-eccentrics outside of the figures that I describe, because I think that even within their context, they were eccentric even within that context. I mean, Malcolm X, for example, uh, experienced a lot of resistance and pushback from Elijah Muhammad and the leadership of the Nation of Islam because they didn't want him pursuing radical forms of politics, which they felt brought undue scrutiny on the Nation of Islam. Julius Lester struggled mightily with his longstanding commitments to Black liberation and his conversion to conservative Judaism. He came to see them as antagonistic, and he couldn't see how he could hold on to a commitment to the Black freedom struggle and be a committed conservative Jew at the same time. And so basically, he abandons the Black freedom struggle and in some respects actually turns sort of hostile toward it.
Mm.
Um, Jan Willis experienced a real conflict between you know, what she describes as two kinds of pieces, whether to pursue the peace of Tibetan Buddhism or to pick up a piece, a gun, and join the Black Panther Party. She opts to, become a Tibetan Buddhism. So even for them, there was a certain kind of tension between their religious commitments and what they saw as the imperatives of the Black freedom struggle. But if I can kind of zoom out from them and sort of look at Black religion more broadly and at Black Protestant Christianity in particular, it seems to me that the forms of Black Christianity now are less able to support a Black freedom movement than those of the mid 20th century. And I mean, I'm sure we can give a lot of reasons for that. I don't want to say something too controversial, but one thing that I think does help explain that is a kind of neo-Pentecostalism that swept over Black Protestant Christianity, and historically, Pentecostal forms of Christianity have been somewhat, they've sort of stayed out of the political realm, and they simply don't have the history or the orientation for providing the kind of infrastructure and organizing support that the Methodist Church and the Baptist Church provided for, the mid 20th century civil rights movement. So I think it's not a surprise that the last significant, though short-lived, Black freedom movement that we had, which was the Black Lives Matter movement, which more or less emerges in about 2014. And basically, since I would say 2021 has been defunct. So, it had about a 7-year run. But the interesting things about the Black Lives Matter movement is that the institutional Black church was not present.
Right.
It was not part of the movement. Its ethos, its values, its ways of organizing, none of that characterized the Black church movement. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement. It was militantly unchurched, if not anti-church. And I think that that's significant. I think that's significant because, for 100 years, the Black church was central to Black freedom struggles. And I see a kind of break that seems to have appeared, at least with respect to the Black Lives Matter movement. And so this is a roundabout answer to your question. I'm not sure that social freedom and justice are factoring within in Black religion, Black Christianity today to the same degree that they did in the past.
I mean, you said so much, and I'm in so much agreement with you, especially when you talk about the Black Lives Matter, right? Or movement for Black lives, people often said, "Oh, it's not religious," and I'm like, "No, it's just not Christian," right?
Right.
Because the founders are religious, they're
Yes.
just not Christian, and that was again that standard narrative of Black religion at
Yeah.
work, that if it doesn't look a certain way, then it must not be religious. It's like, no, there are other ways of being
Right.
religious. So I'm glad to hear you say that. And of course, at this moment, this particular historical moment, this all feels so relevant to be thinking about how our faith, whatever the hour is, whatever the faith is, right, are connected to what we know are needed movements, right?
And the Black Lives Matter movement and the absence of the Black church is all. I mean, think about the Black Lives Matter movement. Disproportionately, the people involved in that movement were millennials, Zoomers, and younger people. And if you look at Pew data, 22% of Black people now identify as nuns.
Right.
Now, that means a lot of different things, but one of the things it does mean is that people are engaging in, to use my own term, Afro-eccentric forms of spirituality.
Right, because
that
there
are
are enough boxes.
disconnected
The Pew City
from
didn't have enough boxes to
right
check.
that are disconnected from the disciplines and the norms of the Black church. So you're absolutely right. It's not that they are anti-religious or non-spiritual. It's just that they are not, standard expressions of those things, because they feel that the Black church is too narrow and does not encompass, ways of being, and basically, and quite frankly, forms of justice that they're interested in, like various forms of gender,
right.
And identity justice, that they feel that the Black church is just too resistant to.
Totally. I mean, we're going to get off topic for a second, but I'm going to see if you come with me about this as you're thinking through this. I'm thinking particularly about these movements for justice, right? Oh, hold on. I almost lost the thought. Where'd it go? Hold on. Oh, okay. So coming back, thinking about these movements for justice, and then going back right to where you began with the leaders even in the 1960s. And so many of these movements were actively undermined, right, by US governmental forces. And that's also true for the movement of Black Lives.
Right,
Black
right,
Lives. I wonder if the internet sped up that
right,
undermining, right? Because
right.
there's so much communication that couldn't be but so private when you're in an age of the internet, that may have had kind of a more, I'm thinking of the old game of telephone, used to play with the can and the strings, that a more kind of underground network that was more, that could have been more operative in a non-digital age. Hey, what are your reflections on
I
that?
mean, absolutely. I'm so glad that you raised that. I mean, because this is a point that I sort of make to students all the time as well. Um, there's an old saying that how the speed at which lies travel, as
Mhm.
as opposed to truth. Lies travel very, very quickly, and of course, the speed of digital technologies makes lies and misinformation and propaganda and scandal, circulate at such speed that it undermines all kinds of disciplines. Um, and you know, in the past, I mean, imagine if digital technology media existed during the King movement. All of his business would have been in the streets.
All his
He
business.
would have been treated like T.D. Jakes is being treated today,
Mm,
and his authority would have been tremendously undermined. So there's some really, really negative, sides of social media. But another negative side of social media, not only that it creates an environment in which it's hard to actually hold people accountable. You have a lot of sort of blaming and shaming, but not kind of deliberative processes where you can sort of hold people accountable, and where people can go through a process of repentance and repair.
right.
In the digital environment, all you have is blame and shame.
Mhm.
There are no there's no process of deliberation and rehabilitation. It's blame and shame.
Mhm.
Uh, and the other problem with the digital technology is that because you can mobilize people quickly,
Mhm.
then you think you don't have to organize people.
Mm.
And there's a big difference between organizing and mobilizing. You can mobilize a flash mob very quickly, but you don't know who the person is beside you.
Right.
You don't know whether or not you can actually put your life in their hands. Where if you go back to the Black freedom struggle of the mid 20th century, people trained,
Mhm.
they acquired disciplines. They knew that the person sitting next to them at the counter, or the person marching with them, had their back. You just don't know that in under digital mobilization, and so these kinds of protests simply don't have the same kind of disciplines that the organized protests of the past had. Yeah, you can produce much larger protests. You can put them together much more quickly, but you would be hard pressed to point to any protest, no matter how large it is, that had any of the kind of staying power
Mhm.
or long-term beneficial effects that many of these programs had in the past. So I think that's the other side of downside of the rapidity of digital technologies. They enable people to bypass the hard work of actually getting to know people, figuring out what it is that they want, building consensus together, and then going out and trying to compel the powers that be to give you what you want. And so I think that's a downside as well. You know, so little came out of the largest, social action protest in American history after, in the wake of the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd. Very little came out of that. They were huge.
Mm-hmm.
They engaged many people, but very little of it substantively came out of it.
I know. I think I want to come back to, I want to stay on this topic for a minute because also the beginning of our conversation, you said it was like people had to be in certain cities to see this diversity of Black religiosity in certain urban areas. But now with the internet, people can be exposed to a variety of religious traditions. And in fact, these traditions can grow in many ways, even if you aren't in Philly, DC, New York, right? These Atlanta, these cities that were kind of the meeting places, right? Um, could you reflect a little bit on how you think that might be affecting
Yeah,
people's understanding of Black religiosity?
yeah, yeah. I mean, I have
Or
a
maybe
lot of thoughts.
maybe even not how it is, maybe your hope for what it might
Yeah.
be doing too.
No, I have a lot of thoughts, on that. A lot of things are going on. I think that traditional disciplined forms of Black religion are losing some of their authority. Because if you have a computer, an internet connection, and the right algorithm, you too can become a religious expert. And so you have religious experts in traditions who are in competition with people on the internet. And the internet has a kind of leveling effect because the average person uh, doesn't have the wherewithal to distinguish between people who actually have acquired the knowledge and experience to actually be authorities and those who simply have a great presence, online and acquire a following. So I mean, I think the easy availability of endless options uh, 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 undermines tradition forms of religion, but it also I don't want to sound like a I can't think of the word. There are so many religious options that are available on the internet that it produces a kind of cafeteria spirituality,
Hmm.
which is a, another manifestation of consumer spirituality.
I mean, yes, I'm in so much agreement with you. And I'm sure that there will be listeners who are either loving this or shaking their hands at the
Right,
podcast.
right, right.
But I'm glad we're having these conversations because all of these are affecting, right? The way we understand what happens when people break these unspoken rules, but they really are still rules, right? Of what it means to be Black and religious.
I also think that the technologies also just affect, and again, this is not going to be true of all churches. I think it's true specifically of certain kinds of Protestant churches. You see them in Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal churches, non-denominational churches. I don't think you see them in Catholic churches. You probably don't see them in high church forms of Protestantism like Anglicanism, so forth and so on. And that is ubiquity of the screens.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, I
Well,
mean, I can
some of them, the
experience
high church is still
I
like
can
bells and
experience
they still like bells and smells, right? We call them.
bells and smells, but also it produces this weird, weird sort of situation. I don't know if you had this experience or not, but you're in a service. There's a big screen with the image being reproduced on the screen. And I feel even though the preacher, the choir, other religious actors are right there in front of me, I find my eyes being drawn to the big screen. And then you have people drawn to the big screen at the same time drawn to the small screen. on their phone or their tablet. And so you have this weird sort of digital circuit going on where the actual real life people are being mediated by the reproduced image on the big screen, on the wall, and on the small screen on their phone. And I find this is a look. I don't want to. I'm not a luddite, and so I don't want to sort of come across as a luddite. Uh, but I see real ways in which that technology and the way it's being used within religious services uh, degrades the quality of the service, and I think it sort of undermines the prospect or the ability to engage in sort of focused attention. Kind of meditative attention, I think, becomes much more difficult uh, when your attention is being split between live person and the big screen on the wall and the small screen on your hands, especially since many people are now being encouraged to follow things on the small screen in their hand as well. And it produces, to me, just a weird sort of disassociation and scattered attention, which sounds a lot like what the rest of our digital experience is, where we just have multiple things competing for our attention at the same time, our attention gets split. So, I mean, if you are of a certain kind of mindset and you think that part of what it means to be religious or to engage in a religious practice is to cultivate a certain kind of focused attention, it seems to me that these digital technologies make that increasingly more difficult.
Oh, I definitely hear what you're saying, right? It's on one level, it gives so much access, right? For
Right,
people who can't get out and
right,
right. I mean, this is what happened so much with COVID. None of us could go out, but even there have always been people who couldn't get out, right?
right,
To go places or access things. So you get access to more diversity, you get access you didn't have that maybe you wanted. And then, right, it changes the religious experience. And it's like this is the opposite of meditation, right? It is,
right,
and I'm thinking about, the current brain science around multitasking and the knowledge that actually people don't multitask, you just shift
right.
very quickly,
Exactly.
and how that in many ways undermines our ability to use our brains at the capacity at which we could use them, right?
Right.
Um, so
And I mean, if spiritual experience is sort of a kind of focus where
Mhm.
everything else falls away. You know, I mean, ultimately, if you deep experience where your own ego falls away, you
Right.
know, that's just it. Just seems to me that that becomes very, very difficult in this highly mediated form of religious worship and experience that we have now in the contemporary Black church, understood as Baptist, Methodist, and Pentecostal.
Well, I mean, thank you so much for such a lively conversation. And I think we've gotten into a bunch of great spheres of discussion. Let's say we have a listener who's hearing about you talk about this standard narrative of Black religion, and you're like, yes, I need to know more about that and more about what it means to live outside of that. Where should they start? What would you recommend is a good place to start thinking
Yeah.
more? Aside from your books, of course.
Well, I mean, a I guess an accessible text that they might look at would to sort of get into this, especially to look at sort of Afro-diasporic forms of religiosity, would be Joseph Murphy's.
Oh,
Let me see if I
the
can.
red book, right?
It's about
It's the red book, I'm thinking, right?
yeah. He talks about yeah. So let me see if I can get the title of that. Um, Work in the Spirit.
Yes,
Work
working.
in the Spirit, Ceremonies of the African Diaspora. And it's good for a variety of reasons. He looks at four Afro-diasporic traditions, Candomblé, Santeria, others, and there's also a chapter on the Black church. So he's putting the Black U.S. church sort of in dialogue with these Afro-diasporic traditions. Uh, More challenging books, but that I highly recommend, would be Yoruba Traditions and African American Religious Nationalism by my friend Tracy Hawks. Um, Also, her more recent book, would be useful as well. And then I guess the book that to me, again, if you're really interested in thinking about African religions and their ongoing presence in the New World, would be Flash of the Spirit.
Oh yeah,
Um,
like Robert Farris
it's
Thompson.
yeah, and it's subtitled African and Afro-American Art and Philosophy, and it explores the influence of Congo, Yoruba, and a whole variety of traditions in the United States. And it's just a fabulous, a magnificent book that goes deep because it sort of, I mean, religion is so deeply situated in larger cultural forms, especially art and cosmology. And so I find that to be an incredibly useful resource myself.
And I will make sure we have all this in the show notes so people can grab that without having to grab a pen right now and write it all down. The question I'm asking all of our guests are to share a bit about, a spiritual leader who's been important to you. You might choose an academic leader since we're having an academic conversation, but would you share a bit about someone who's been meaningful for you in your own thoughts and reflections, and even your faith journey, if you like?
Yeah, I mean, rather than a person,
Mhm.
it would probably be easier and more fruitful for me to mention, Antioch Missionary Baptist Church in Phoenix, Arizona, where I was, socialized. I mean, it was a rhetorically uh, and ritually, rich, warm and rich environment, where, biblical stories came alive. And, I was just sort of captivated by the stories, by the figures, by the events, by the places that were narrated in the stories that I heard and that were acted out in a variety of ways. And, even though I don't think of myself as a conventionally religious person, you know, um, the rhythms, the music, the rhetorical style, the performance of all kind, have shaped my bodily comportment. It's shaped me, morally and ethically, in ways that I can't, fully express. So I rather talk about the influence of that childhood institution on me, which I think is still present in me. Um, I'm 67 now, so it's still present in me, long after I left that church. I mean, if I were to mention one person as a kind of both intellectual and academic teacher, I will say Cornel West,
Mm.
who has pushed me to think about a whole host of things in a deeper uh, and capacious way.
Well, thank you so much for your time and for sharing about the communities and the people who have shaped you, and for giving us your rich ideas about the standard narrative of Black religion and Afro-eccentricity. I think these are giving us terms to talk about what, is really happening in a lot of the conversations on the podcast. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm glad you came to join us. To our listeners, stay tuned for our next episodes and continue to keep listening, to keep learning, to keep reading, and to keep breaking the rules for how religion is supposed to work.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Diverse Devotions, Black Belief Across Boundaries. I hope today's conversation has sparked something in you, whether it's a question, a new insight, or simply a deeper understanding of the many ways Black folk engage with spirituality and religion. Remember to check out the show notes for more resources. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe or follow, rate, and share to help others discover the power of diverse religious experiences. We'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment or send us a message about your thoughts and experiences at diversedevotions.com. Until next time, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep breaking